Hello, everybody. Well, that worked a lot better than I expected it to. Am I too loud? No, great. Welcome back from lunch. Let's make a start on the last session of the ANROWS conference, focusing on intervention and responses to perpetrators of family and domestic violence and sexual assault. I'd like to start by acknowledging, really importantly, of course, that we're on Wurundjeri land, and that not only are the Wurundjeri people the traditional owners of the land that we're sitting and have our feet on, that they're also very much the sovereign owners. And I'd like to recognise an ongoing Indigenous struggle for self-determination, and that part of that struggle is the work that we need to do, or that I need to do as a person with white privilege, to understand what that privilege means, how it's given to me, to understand that it's in the walls, that it's within me, and that there's a lot of work amongst us as still colonisers of an occupied land to understand what that privilege means, and to walk alongside our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sisters and brothers around their struggles for self-determination, freedom and dignity. And I think that leads really well onto the first of the two presentations focusing on the perpetrator prevention and intervention stream that Dr. Michael Salter will be given, which is partly around privilege. And I think the privilege that I have as a white person has a lot of similarities to the privilege that I have as a male, and what that means to start to recognise that privilege. And Michael will be talking a lot about, not only is this about changing attitudes, but it's also about focusing on structures. Michael has done a lot of work at the intersection of gender, violence and culture, and the ways in which violence is made meaningful by victims, perpetrators and others. His ongoing research has been in areas including child sexual abuse, its impact across the lifespan, medical and legal responses to gendered violence, mental illness and subsidised abuse in traumatised populations. He's got a background in public health and public policy, has worked in the non-government and university sectors in translating policy and research into practice, which is very much, of course, what this conference is about. And he aims to combine theoretical and empirical insights to inform this work in a range of areas. So for myself, as my name's Rodney, as a member of No to Violence Peak Body in Victoria, I've been greatly influenced by Michael's work, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Michael to the stage, who will be focusing on the next 20 minutes on changing attitudes amongst boys and men, and that changing attitudes is not enough, though, in the role of men and boys in the prevention of violence against women and their children. So let's give a warm welcome to Michael. He'll be speaking for 20 minutes, followed by questions.
Thanks to Rodney. It was a very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone here, because your attention and energy on the last session of the last day of the conference is much appreciated. I'm here to speak about some of the work that I've been doing at Western Sydney Uni with colleagues Murakami and Gia Presta-Rastuan. We were engaged a few years ago by the New South Wales Government, who I think was just starting to catch wind of some of the headwinds coming from Victoria, particularly around primary prevention. And so looking to develop a framework in New South Wales, looking to start to think through how can we do this work better up the coast. So I called this changing attitudes is not enough because I think in the primary prevention space there's often been an assumption made by different agencies, different parts of literature, different advocates, that all that we need to do is get men and boys in a room, talk to them about their attitudes, do a post-program evaluation, and we say, yes, they're a bit less sexist, therefore we have prevented violence against women. And actually, there's not strong evidence that that's the case. We can't assume a direct relationship between attitudes and behaviour. It is true that attitudes are a strong predictor of future perpetration, but what we also know is that for men and boys, often they don't understand their own behaviour, they don't understand their own perpetrating behaviour, and very often their pro-abuse attitudes develop after perpetration as an explanation or a justification of what they've already done. So for us, this program, this project was an invitation for us to start to think through conceptually where to situate work with men and boys in the primary prevention of violence against women, with a really strong recognition that engaging men and boys is not synonymous with primary prevention. Okay, primary prevention interventions are much, much broader. We need a much broader scope of primary prevention thinking, of which engaging men and boys, it's an important aspect, but it's not the only aspect. So we wanted to think through that conceptually and also think through that conceptually as well. So programmatically, we wanted to look at some of the programmatic elements. So we were asked by the government to look at 4 key questions. So what's the effectiveness of existing approaches, strategies and projects that aim to prevent violent behaviour of men and boys throughout Australia? What are the characteristics of good practice in men and boys primary prevention and early intervention? What strategies and programs should be developed to build on existing good practice? And what exemplar or demonstration projects could be implemented in New South Wales to advance practice? And how would this be evaluated? So our conceptual framework for the project has sort of evolved over time. It drew a little bit, obviously Moira Carmody's worked in this area for a long time. My background's in public health. Before I worked in violence against women, I worked in the prevention of Hep C and HIV. And so we were really interested in looking at, okay, well, what does primary prevention actually mean when we're talking about gendered violence? And we started to look at 2 broad areas of primary prevention work. And so they're a little simplistic, but we are just talking about some broad categories here. So reducing gender inequality as a structural issue, okay? So when we're talking about a structural issue, we are talking about, good old important issues like gendered divisions of labour. Okay, we're talking about asset accumulation over the lifespan. We're talking about obstacles to full participation in public life for women, but we're also talking about the various factors that can hold women in a private context and exploit their labour and so on. So reducing gender inequality in terms of the way that society is structured and ordered to privilege men at the expense of women. So gender inequality on one hand, and then changing norms, attitudes and values on the other. So addressing, in a sense, the cultural dimension of gender inequality. So with those 2 sort of broad divisions in mind, why engage boys and men? What's the point? So firstly, as has been recognised already at the conference, many people will agree, we happen to live in a male-dominated society. It's hard to change that society if men and boys aren't on board, okay, if they disagree. So we need to engage men and boys. We need to explain to men and boys why this work's important and what potential role they can play in it. There are many men and boys that agree with that work and want to become part of it. So primary prevention can actually be an invitation to men and boys to get on board and be a part of change that they value and that they want to see happen in their society. But of course, we do want to see attitudinal change, and we want to see behavioural change amongst men and boys at an individual and a collective level, and that's a key aim of primary prevention. So in other work, I've referred to the 2 dimensions of primary prevention. So we've got structural gender inequality on one hand, and then we've got kind of norms and attitudes on the other. And doing that work simultaneously is really, really important. When we just focus on norms and attitudes, so we've got social marketing campaigns, we've got education campaigns, we're rolling programs out in schools, we may see some short-term changes in attitudes and behaviour, but when the broader context around that behaviour doesn't change, when it's the same, when it's still unequal, when the messages that men and boys are getting from their society and from the context in which they live reinforces male privilege, then we're going to see a drag. We're going to see a drag on those programmatic effects. Okay, we're going to see things return to baseline pretty quickly. But when we look internationally, there's examples where women's economic, social status has been increased in a range of ways, primarily through increased workforce participation, increases in income. And when those increases in women's autonomy and empowerment, when they haven't been married with cultural change and work with men and boys to lay the groundwork for that change, we've seen backlash. Backlash in the form of increased risk of physical and sexual violence. So working with these two prevention domains, it seemed to us was really important. And as I said, this conceptual framework, we didn't necessarily go into the project with it in mind. It was something that sort of emerged and developed as we went through data collection. Hopefully, if I don't talk too much, we'll have a chance to look at two key examples, two key programs that we identified in New South Wales that we felt encapsulated this quite well. So the methodology, initially the lit review and the program review, and then stage 2, which I do want to focus on, was consultation with national stakeholders. So a lot of the information I'm going to present really is the synthesis of practice knowledge that has been developed at the coalface by prevention workers who are doing this work already. We had online surveys, and this was just intended to identify stakeholders. We distributed them relatively broadly, and just to look at the variety of programs, prevention programs that were out there, and also the kind of work they were doing and where they were doing it in the country. And then we engaged 37 stakeholders in interviews and focus groups, followed by thematic data analysis. And then after this, we identified some best practice programs. So what I'd like to draw on now is just what prevention program managers and workers were telling us works, okay? Engaging men and boys. So engaging men and boys, not as a primary prevention activity, just what do you need to do to actually get men and boys in the room? What do you need to do to actually get them on board, okay? Before prevention starts. It's really important that we don't assume that men's bums on seats is preventing violence against women, okay? Just getting men engaged is work, as I think many of us understand. Majority of the people that we interviewed from Victoria, okay, because this is the hub of primary prevention here in Australia. We had services from New South Wales, one from the Northern Territory, but we really struggled to identify specific primary prevention activities in other areas of the country. If that was an oversight, you're welcome to come and correct me in the question time. So interviews conducted, program developers, implementers. We also spoke with policymakers. I'm sure there's a few in the room. So a range of programs and activities, but there was a really strong focus on either working with young men or working in disadvantaged populations. So it was pretty rare that we actually found a primary prevention activity that was targeting high-income men, that was targeting men at senior levels in an organisation or a community context. By and large, the men and the boys being engaged in primary prevention were relatively powerless, which I think is interesting when we think that primary prevention, one of its remits is social change. How much change do these participants have? How much power do these participants have to change the context in which they live, if they're teenage boys, if they're primarily disadvantaged, and so on. So I'll just go through 5 key strategies that stakeholders told us were really important around engaging boys and men in the primary prevention sort of project. So negotiating masculinity, recognising disadvantage, framing prevention for boys and men, peer-to-peer approaches, and then ensuring accountability. So negotiating masculinity. What stakeholders told us was that a one-size-fits-all approach to masculinity just doesn't work. Talking to men and boys about real men or heroes, be the hero, be a real man, is a really good way of alienating men and boys from just the complexity of our experiences of masculinity, the ambiguities of being a man in a male-dominated society or a boy in a male-dominated society. So a sports club prevention program facilitator, she said to us, we had an understanding of gender in our program that was not purely about hegemonic masculinity, but was about the ways that masculinities might run in parallel within a particular person. So one of the guys was a really tough player, a fearsome football player in the day. I remember watching him, he was just hardcore, but an extraordinarily gentle guy off the field, and then very articulate about why he played and about the way he played and why he played like he did. People aren't one aspect of their gender. So this was a really nice way for program workers to actually get in and start to sort of unpack the complexities of masculinity. But with a one-dimensional view of masculinity as just strong and strong, tough men don't hit women, that sort of stuff, it actually wasn't connecting with men and boys very well. And violence is fundamental identity stuff for men and boys. Violence, aggression is something that we grow up with. It's something that's inculcated in us. We're told that it's a fundamental part of who we are, biologically, psychologically, spiritually. We're encouraged to identify with and internalise violence and aggression. And men and boys have a diversity of experiences of violence, including violence against women. And so, as a prevention program facilitator said here, this is rich stuff for men and boys. There's a lot of us to mine with if we're willing to engage with the complexity of their experience. She said, I think the ethics of education are really interesting. You are messing with people, especially around this stuff. It's very fundamental identity stuff. There were also victims and survivors of sexual assault in the groups too, people from families with lots of trauma. Lots of people disclosed to us or told us stories of friends and sisters and so on who had experienced violence. What that was like for them or their mothers, so there was no sense in which it didn't resonate for them. So that issue around the complexity around masculinity and violence sort of flows on into the next theme around recognising disadvantage. Men's experiences of power in their communities can be contextualised by broader experiences of powerlessness, shame, humiliation, particularly when people are in a difficult context. If they're low income, if they belong to a racialised or an ethnic minority group, or they might be in the middle of a migration experience. So these are all very good reasons to be working with men and boys in those communities around the violence that women and kids are experiencing there. But how do you do it in a sensitive way? How do you do it that recognises gender relations and gendered power is not the only form of power that's operative in this context, and we need to identify that experience in men and boys. So policy experts said to us, the challenge with that too, that there are men and boys who are disenfranchised, for whom power is not an experience they actually have, unless maybe it's lording it over someone else. But in the grand scheme of things, they're profoundly disenfranchised. So we spoke to a number of people working in migrant and refugee communities doing primary prevention work, trying to build capacity around violence against women. And one facilitator said the first thing they see, so this is in a refugee community, is they've got to give up something and they've got to give up a lot. So the first thing that the men see is that when they're being challenged around their attitudes to gender and power, they've got to give up, they're being asked to surrender that. And to them, that might be all that they have. They're already unemployed. They already can't find work. Their role in the family has been trashed in their way of thinking. And then you want me to give up this. You want me to give up male privilege as well. So a program coordinator in a school who was working in a school with quite a high proportion of islander kids. And he said that's constantly at the forefront of our minds, that these young people walk around carrying a lot of shame already, around racial discrimination, but also around poverty. So how do we correct this or support them to challenge that thinking, challenge sexist thinking, challenge misogynist thinking, but without further shaming them or somehow adding to the sense of stigma that they're already feeling? So framing prevention for men and boys, a number of facilitators said to us, when we do a general primary prevention sort of intervention, especially at a school or a university, who buys in? Who buys in? Women. Women and girls. Women and girls buy in really quickly. A generalist message around primary prevention is a great way to engage women and girls in this work. You're doing well. And actually, we need to do work around, okay, well, what's actually going to get men and boys in? What's going to work? And saying to men and boys, you have a responsibility to prevent violence against women. We might morally agree that that's the case, but the question is whether it's actually effective in getting them through the door. So one university worker just said to us, no, he said, I spent a year doing this, saying you've got a responsibility to prevent violence, and just getting no buy-in into his program. So a community-based educator said, well, these are the questions we ask. What kind of father do you want to be? What kind of father, what kind of husband, what kind of man do you want to be? Now, I've sat in on sessions where those questions have been asked in the introduction to the program. These are the things that we're going to be exploring, and instantly the men will hear that as recognisable. I've seen the hardest, most brutal-looking man reduced to tears in that very moment, because everybody, I think, just wants to be good. So doing that additional work around framing primary prevention and framing the cessation of violence against women, as congruent with the goals and aspirations that men already have in their lives, okay, to be good dads, good brothers, good fathers, good friends, good managers, good CEOs, good whoever. And making that link where actually violence against women means that they can't live the kinds of lives that they want, they can't have the kinds of families they want, they can't be in the kinds of communities that they want to live in and that they want to be proud of. And for program workers and facilitators, this was a really good fulcrum for them working with men and boys. So peer-to-peer approaches was an aspect of many of the programs for a range of reasons. It was a good way of really testing the waters and getting a sense of what's going on in the room with the men and boys. What are they really thinking? And where problematic aspects do come up, where somebody might say something. So a lot of program facilitators talked about the dickhead moment, where somebody just said something absolutely horrific. And rather than jumping in, actually allowing there to be a space for someone else in the room to say, actually, I don't agree, that's a real problem, that's a real challenge. So where men and boys in their own communities, in their own institutions, are then taking carriage of the prevention message and driving that to within their own cohort. Okay, they have ownership of that message, they agree with that message, and they're delivering it to other men and boys has been, by and large, facilitators said, really, really powerful. There are some risks involved that it does need to be coordinated and facilitated, but really important. So a school-based facilitator said, when you have the peer-led approach where participants say something that's not consistent with our program, usually peers actually respond the right way. So what do you think about what Johnny said, like saying that so-and-so is a slut for doing that? And usually their peers, they come up with alternative responses like, yeah, no, that's not cool. So instead of being authoritative and telling them what's the right or wrong answer, the peer-led approach is just engaging discussion, getting them to come up with the answers and drawing out responses from them. 9 times out of 10, it works like that. And I think the other point here is that it models a different kind of communication, a different kind of power relations in the room. If you're just reproducing kind of an authoritative power over model over the participants, it's actually the kind of power relation that is conducive to violence. And an interesting point here actually for a program facilitator is just within that peer-led approach and that peer model, allowing the diversity of gendered relations and experiences to come to the surface. We can't assume, for example, that the older men are the right people to be mentoring the young men. And she said in many cases, the young men might be engaging, for example, with their female partners in a much more egalitarian way than the coaches or the CEOs are. They might have many more women friends than the older men have. The older men might always be socialising in all male groups, whereas the young guys have always had a mixed friendship group. The older men can't necessarily see that the younger men have, in fact, a very different approach to gender than they do. Okay. And finally, ensuring accountability. So, the really good, in our view, the really good primary prevention work was being done either within and by organisations that have got a long history in the women's sector working in domestic violence and sexual assault, because they understand the dynamics and they understand the ways in which men legitimise and justify violence against women, and they're aware of it. Really good primary prevention programs are often in dialogue with victim support services and perpetrator programs. So there's this constant kind of dialogue and flow, and ideally there's primary prevention, victim support and perpetrator interventions happening in the same context at the same time. So the workers may well be all operating in the same context. This was really important. And that programs were accountable and they had feedback mechanisms back to their community and back to affected women. So this is a service manager talking about men's programs operating in a number of rural and regional locations. And she said the blokes who are actually running the programs are domestic violence and sexual assault offenders. If behaviours like violence against women and kids come up in the men's programs, it's absolutely excused, because these programs were operating solo. They had a little bit of local government, local council funding. They're operating on their own. There was no background of expertise and there was no accountability to feed back into the communities and back into the other services. So what I'd like to do very briefly, I've got a couple of minutes, is just flag two really good programs that we really liked. Okay, so Strong Aboriginal Men is run out of the Education Centre Against Violence in New South Wales. ECAV has a very, very long history of working, 30 years of history working with Aboriginal communities. They have a memorandum of understanding and quite a robust Aboriginal Communities Matters advisory group that's been in place for a long time. And basically the Aboriginal women said to ECAV, please stop just talking to us. You need to talk to our men as well. You need to do work with our men. And so ECAV went through the process of actually hiring and skilling up an Aboriginal male education workforce, which has been a really, I think, interesting experience. I can't speak for them, but it seemed to be a really quite a nourishing experience for their service. And so what ECAV does is that it embeds the direct program delivery, 3 workshops, okay, with Aboriginal men and boys over the age of 16. Communities come forward through the community-based networks that the educators already have. They nominate and they say, look, we think that we've got an issue in our community and we'd like some support. We'd like a facilitated community discussion. And so there's a prolonged period of consultation, building networks of support, getting a sense of the local history, the local dynamics of the community, before providing these 3 workshops over 3 consecutive months. And then working with the men in the workshops to develop an action plan around preventing violence against women. So what this allows the men to do is to identify in their experience the drivers of violence against women in their own lives and also in their community. So self-identify the problems that are happening locally, and then what are the solutions? What are the solutions that they can reasonably implement with ECAV support? So a few really interesting aspects of Strong Aboriginal Men. It works in tandem with 2 other programs that ECAV delivers. Strong Aboriginal Women, okay, working with women around their legal rights and their human rights and their access to social services, and also Weaving the Net, which is a child protection intervention. And what was great about Strong Aboriginal Men is that it was often unfolding at the same time that Strong Aboriginal Women was, which meant that there was that dialogue. Between the Aboriginal male workers and the female workers. A strong focus on connecting community members with available services. So it's not just a primary prevention intervention. They're looking at how does our program sit within the available health and human services that are already operating in the community that community members might not know about, they might not be strongly connected to. And a really interesting aspect of this program that we really liked, which I'm going to tell you about very briefly and then conclude, is that the men who complete the 3 workshops then become eligible to articulate into a Cert 4 and to start to become trained up in primary prevention and trauma-informed healthcare in their own communities with possible articulation into tertiary education. We really like this about the program, the way in which it creates a legitimate pathway for men in the community to actually take this work forward and drive it in their own community. Other good programs, I have 1 minute. So key learnings, some common themes in best practice. So we're particularly focused on these community and organisational level interventions, these sort of locally based interventions that can be iterative but also flexible. So there's a good sense of what the program is and what it wants to achieve, but it's also responsive to these locally based needs. We see some mutually reinforcing components where there's face-to-face programming, but those normative changes is potentially sustained by structural changes. So changing policies, changing services, building social infrastructure and networks of support. Identify and nurture talent. Where there's people that want to do the primary prevention work, they should be enabled to do so. And I think that's really, really important, looking at the long-term health of primary prevention. And situating violence prevention within a web of prevention, making sure it's pulling in the same direction as other primary prevention and health promotion interventions, linking violence prevention to the social determinants of health and well-being. Many, many other things to say. If you'd like to read more, this is Less to Lose, More to Gain. If you Google that, you'll be able to find it online. Thank you for listening.
It's working. I like the way you talk, Michael. Fantastic. But this next bit obviously isn't about me. It's, especially speaking as a man, this should not be about me. But Really, I don't want to place too many parameters on the questions because I think a number of you may have specific questions about aspects of the research that Michael and Moira and others did as part of that University of Western Sydney study. But I think one of the things that really strikes me is that prevention work is something that we all know is important and we've evolved into, and there's so much work being done out there. But how to translate knowledge, research, thinking into practice when all of us have a stake in prevention, and particularly as we start to wither away the difference between tertiary interventions and primary prevention, is really challenging. So I'm really curious about anybody's questions or thoughts about what does that knowledge transfer and exchange mean like when it's not as if we have a very simple defined workforce that engages in prevention. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and invite anybody to ask the first one.
Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm thinking about the distinction between the engagement of men and boys in violence prevention and leadership of men and boys, and I find that sometimes that distinction isn't as clear in violence prevention programs as they could be. And I just wonder if you could reflect a bit on how that might have come through, that issue might have come through in your research.
So just to clarify, so the question is around the difference between male leadership in primary prevention and then sort of engaging men and boys, is that right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think cultivating male leadership in the primary prevention space is inevitable. I think it's something that we need to do. I think that there are questions around the privileging of male leadership in this space, given that it continues to be driven by women. It continues to be driven by women. Nonetheless, I think that it is work that needs to be done. And I mean, I'm regularly contacted by men who actually want to do more. They know what they want to do. And what we need to furnish men and boys with is a positive agenda that's going to work. What constitutes preventative action in this space? What works in the community, particularly amongst men and boys who are never going to become perpetrators? We can't treat primary prevention as just a watered down perpetrator intervention. You know, the majority of men and boys, and our biggest allies, our biggest resource is the basic unspoken groundswell of goodwill amongst men and boys who want to see this stopped. And so I think we need to capitalise on that, but really furnish them with what actually can you do in order to drive this forward. So for me, that's the sort of answer to male leadership. It is around, okay, well, this is something that you can do, whether you're driving change in your community, you're driving change in an institutional setting. And to be frank, you know, I think we need to think about everyday men and boys. What's our messaging to them at a family level? What can they do to prevent violence against women, given that most are never going to perpetrate it? So I don't know if I fully answered your question. I don't think so.
I guess some of the concerns that I have heard expressed are about the way that sometimes men's leadership can, even instead of transforming gender relationships, can entrench the gender hierarchy. And then I've seen that happen in the violence prevention space as well. So I was kind of thinking about how we might need to kind of rethink what we mean by leadership, and it's great for men to take leadership, but what does that mean vis-a-vis women's leadership in this space?
Look, I think as a question, I think I'll take it under notice. I think it is a really important, and it's something that we're really sort of grappling with at the moment, is that for a male soldier to say don't rape women, you get to become Australian of the Year. And you know, it's actually just saying, please treat women like a human being in the organisation that I'm a part of. Well, it's a really, really great message, but to what extent do we value the man, and to what extent do we value the message? I think we need to value the message.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm really pleased you're doing this. I raised a son and had to confront a lot of problems to do with this and breaking those cycles. There is one issue that I would like to bring up, and that's the one about the older men.
Yep.
and the younger men coming through, and the lack of discussion around the economics of this.
Sure.
It used to be that if young men went off and married and had a family, they could put 5,000 down if they worked hard and buy a house and get on with their life. That is not the case. Most young men cannot raise families unless they have the economic input from their own families. Now that means that those older men are controlling the dialogue and they have an economic tool to use. Now I've seen that pressure being placed on a lot of young men. How do you think that particular issue can be approached? Because it is about their identity as well.
I don't know that I can speak to that specific form of sort of economic control per se, but I think that the issue around class and the issue around economics is really important in primary prevention. And I think when we look at the different economic locations of men and boys and women, we start to identify the different ways that power relations can play out, the different ways that gender inequality starts to manifest across the community. And I think that that's just a really important evolving aspect of work. And it's been really good over the last couple of days to see more focus and attention and more discussion around some economic issues, because I think that they do underlie the kinds of constrained choices that are available to men and boys and also to women and girls. And those constrained choices can place people in a position of vulnerability. Yeah. I think there's a question over there.
Hi, I had a question. My name's Renata. I'm from the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service in New South Wales. Just a question about programs in schools, and I was wondering if you could comment about, I know that there's many programs that are being rolled out that they're expecting to be taught by teachers without any specific training around them and minimum standards about, I'm just interested to hear your comments about that.
So the question was about the rolling out of programs in schools, and certainly in the sort of background research work that we were doing, what we were seeing was some very, very good work in schools that's being done in a holistic kind of way. So particularly where there are it's a kind of a whole of school approach. So there's changes to the ways that dating violence is managed in the schools. There's a great program in the States where they put in place effectively a school-based apprehended violence order system, for example, so that if there's a sexual assault or a DV situation amongst their school community, they actually manage it in a kind of a semi-formal justice response. I mean, obviously there's child protection intervention, but at a sort of a lower level, there's a school-based justice response. So there's some really interesting, evolving, innovative work in the school space we should pay attention to. We should also be really attentive to the watering down of primary prevention so that it's just a series of modules delivered by a contractor or a teacher with no work. And I think that's why we need to be kind of hoarding the term preventative, okay? Because we need to have confidence that something is going to reduce violence against women and kids before we say it is prevention. There's lots of good education work that is awareness raising. There's lots of good education work that is capacity building. But if we don't have strong evidence that it's robust enough to be preventative, I really think we have to be a bit jealous of that term and really hold it back and not give that term to everything that claims it. Because, we came across programs that were single session, and the kids talked about violence, and then they did a poster, and then they stuck the posters up in the corridor, and they'd prevented violence against women. Okay, so I think basic minimum standards, and I think really articulating that, but a real articulation of that by funders and by policymakers is really, really crucial. We need to have high standards of this work, high expectations. Thanks.
Okay, I've got two questions, but I'll make them very quick. I used to fund a number of programs, one of which has since morphed into the Cross Borders program. And one of the issues we faced with one program was we were trialing something where with the normal moderator, we also had a reformed abuser, so someone who had practiced violence 10 years ago, talking about how you can turn your life around. In some ways, people thought that was valuable. It was also controversial, so I'd be interested in having your views on that. And secondly, I did research on a completely different topic that quite conclusively showed how little relationship there may be between self-reported attitudes and observed behavior, particularly over time. So I'd be interested in hearing the long-term impact, any mechanisms you know, any studies you know, or any prospective studies looking at that.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of using facilitators who have previously been perpetrators of violence, I think that we need to challenge the thinking that says that primary prevention is working with the good guys. Because that's not the case. If you've got a group of men in the room, or boys over the age of 12, a proportion of them has physically or sexually offended. And I think it's really important to recognise that and then have pathways for those men and boys to address that. Certainly when we were working with Strong Aboriginal Men and we were doing some evaluation work with them, some of the facilitators did disclose histories of perpetration and had gone through a process and a journey that they were then able to speak to other men in a really authentic way. I think it's something just to always keep our eye on. But the fact that someone's disclosed and gotten caught for offending, I mean, we can't assume that someone that hasn't disclosed and hasn't gotten caught isn't offending. And we do see that in, sadly, amongst men that work in this space in a really ostensibly honourable way, and then we discover that they have a history. So I think we just have to be on the ball about that all the time. Your second question was about the relationship of attitudes to behaviour. The fact is that it's not direct. We really, it's a nice sell to policymakers and to politicians, but I think at a programmatic level, we really have to complicate that. What people believe and what they say that they believe and the values that they articulate, there's so much more going on internally, and that all changes over time. We've got good public health evidence to show that there's not a direct relationship between attitudes and behaviour. So from our side, it's about just getting a bit more complex about our understanding of sort of human behaviour and social practice, and working at multiple levels of intervention. If we can transform the context, great. If we can do an educational intervention, great. But just looking at those multiple opportunities for intervention and not assuming that attitudinal change is a panacea, because it's not. Yeah.
I'm afraid, everyone and Michael, we've run out of time for further questions, and I don't know if you're able to stay for the afternoon and people can catch you for afternoon tea. Sorry. Just a couple really, really quick reflections, and I think for me it highlights that for us men, particularly us men who've got multiple forms of privilege, the work that we need to do to prepare other men to not react with backlash as hopefully women are able to gain more economic, cultural and other sources of power that as men we've denied you from, because ultimately ending men's violence against women is only going to happen when there is some actual power differential work done, and there's a lot more power that women really have to take back that us as men have taken away from you for so long. The other thing too is how to do this prevention work in a positive spirit. Absolutely. Be invitational, not activate men's sense of shame, but to realise for those of us who are doing this work or trying to join this struggle as allies in the struggle alongside women to end our violence against women and children, how to be aware of not colonising women's spaces and to dominate and to reproduce patriarchy and how we do that. So there's a reflection that's needed, accountability that's needed, yet we also don't want to scare men off, and I think that's a real struggle and tension that's going to continue with that work. So thank you, Michael, for entering this space and sharing your research of yourself and more and your colleagues. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.